if we have algorithms that are trained on our worst emotions, and they are, because they're the ones that hold our attention the longest, what we essentially create are these dipping pots of either all one side or all the other. And that then, of course, then entrenches worldviews. And then with entrenched worldviews, we lose the power to negotiate and the power to find middle ground.
This is the future.
Hello and welcome to the Alternate Futures podcast, where we chat with indie sci-fi creators about their work, the world, and anything in between, or beyond. I'm your host, Edwin Rydberg, and today I'm here with G.S. Morgan. Gareth spent nearly 2 decades as a police officer before realizing reality wasn't cyberpunk enough, so he wrote his own. A former chief inspector, hostage negotiator, and emergency responder, Gareth has seen firsthand how power structures shape people and how people can fight back. Now, as an academic and researcher in policing, technology, and security, he spends his time examining how systems of control operate both in real life and in the dystopian worlds he creates. When he's not writing about black market augments, rogue law enforcers, and the slow erosion of free will, Gareth can be found analyzing police recruitment, cognitive decision-making, and why people make terrible choices under pressure, a skill that comes in handy when plotting cyberpunk thrillers. Hi, Gareth. Thanks for joining me today.
Nice to meet you, Edwin. Thank you for having me.
So you've mentioned off camera that you're now out of the police force and you're working in the Middle East, escaping our own growing police state over here. And how long has that been then?
So I'm just approaching 5 years, but I'm on a career break now. So technically I could go back. I don't think I will. I've been much happier out of the force than in it. And that's not to say I didn't enjoy my time, because I did. But I think I've reached a point in my life where I want to be more me. And I know that sounds strange, but it will come out in the interview.
Yeah, no, it's not probably not that strange, to be honest. I think a lot of people reach that stage, I think. How long were you in the force then?
So I served for 18 years.
Wow, okay. I guess we're supposed to call it the service, aren't we? I watched Hot Fuzz, so
That's
if you know
it.
that
I'll
movie,
call
yeah.
it the force. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, we actually have that. Even when I'm submitting academic articles now and I'm writing, I often get reviewers come back and say, "Oh, this is called the service," and I'm like, "Oh dear." Inside, it's the force. Outside, it tends to be referred to as the service.
Right. All the PR and the make it sound nicer and everything.
That's it.
It's definitely becoming a force now. I mean, what do we have? Something like 30 people a day being arrested for social media comments. So you've kind of segued into, would you say academia? I mean, you say as an academic and researcher, some of the topics are quite interesting, technology and security, of course, but then also analyzing police recruitment, cognitive decision making. How did you how did you get into that? Did that grow
So there's
naturally
some
from your police?
kind of. I worked in the latter half of my service. I worked at the Home Office. I did some national policing work, and I worked on police education and career pathways, so how people become officers and then how they develop through their career. I got very, very interested in that. I ended up reading a lot of stuff in and around why people make career choices, how they move into particular professions, etc. I won a competition to go and do a master's, which I went to go and do it, and I really enjoyed it. And they offered me a place on a PhD program. And the last 4 years of my service in the police, I was a part-time student doing a PhD, and that PhD was in police recruitment. So I was looking at how people came into the police. And then just as I was about to complete 1 year from finishing, I got the place where I work now got in touch with me, and they were looking for officers who had a lot of service but also had PhDs to come and teach their police officers. And that's how I ended up working in the Middle East, and that's what I do now. So I teach serving officers, basically, the British model of policing.
Okay. Did you find anything interesting regarding how people get interested in becoming police officers? And then also, like, what are the criteria for recruitment? Because some of the stuff we're seeing online really makes you wonder sort of who are they bringing into the service now?
Yeah, I mean, you've really got me on my sore point. You've got to be careful about letting me loose here, Edwin. I can talk for hours.
Fortunately, we can edit.
The bits that I found most interesting it was sociology, the method that I used. So I was looking at how people use their social networks and connections to A, consider being an officer, and then B, navigate the process itself. So how do they use their social resources, if you like? And what I found was that those people who have existing social resources, so if you have a cop in the family or you have a close friend who's a police officer, the navigation of the process is so much easier. I mean, it's crazy how much easier it is. And then that, of course, adds a significant advantage to those people who already have cop connections. And when we're trying to diversify the force, bring people in from different backgrounds, you've got this like kind of invisible force that just stops that. And it's not conscious. I can't imagine that people do this like in a nasty way to try and stop others getting in, but through the way that the recruitment processes are set up, you end up with competition, and those people that have the inside connections will perform better and therefore are prioritized for the roles. So we've been trying for about maybe since 1982, 83 to try and diversify the service and bring in people from different backgrounds. And we found it really, really hard. So I decided to go and study that and kind of dig into why that might be happening, because none of the stuff that I'd researched had ever been looked at before. And it had in other professions, but never in the police. And it was quite a controversial topic because I was looking at something called homophily, which is basically where you self-select. So people who are already police officers are looking for the same traits in the people that they hire. So, of course, this just works straight against any sort of diversification. It just doesn't work because you're constantly bringing in the same types of people with the same backgrounds. So I spent a long time looking at that. And then over the years, that's developed. I now use some machine learning. I use some big data stuff. And I'm trying to figure out what traits make people more successful when they go through police recruitment, what negatively affects you. And also, I suppose you mentioned the other thing about cognitive decision making. Because I've been a police officer for such a long time, I'd noticed these things like people call them hunches. Why do people make particular decisions when they're working as a police officer? And I've also started to look into how officers make intuitive decisions. So that's the next phase of my research. So I've moved slightly out of police recruitment and into cognitive decision making, which is the other subject on there.
Right. Yeah. Because I was wondering, I mean, you did go through a number of reasons and some of them are very interesting. I was wondering whether it was like a knowledge-based thing, family feeds family. So as a former scientist, or my wife's a doctor, we could obviously give our child an advantage going through the system just by the knowledge we have. But you did mention also the selection of people with similar traits. And I have heard that mentioned before. And that's probably, I would consider that probably the most positive thing to come out of the concept of unconscious bias, I suppose, from the progressive side of the issue. I don't think there's a lot of positive things necessarily there, but that one probably is if it's approached properly, isn't it? Because I've heard some business people say, well, I became conscious that I hire other people like myself, and that leads to a natural bias. And so some of these people have actually set up hiring practices so that the people making the decisions throughout the hiring process are more diverse themselves, have more diverse interests, more broader part of the company to sort of equalize or balance out their own view. Is that something that the police might be looking into, somehow broadening the application process?
You've settled on quite a few points that I would say were really interesting, but contested. So I don't want to get too much into the theory because it all gets very esoteric and but the main theory behind it is representative bureaucracy, which is the more representative a service is, the more likely it is to make decisions that are representative of what the people want. That's the underlying theory there. The idea is that if we bring more representative people into the police will then make decisions that are more reflective of the people that they serve. What I would say, unfortunately, is that there's very little empirical backing for that. And while I may think that that's what will happen, that's never been measured. So we're in this really tricky bit where people will say representation in the police is a necessary thing that we all need and it will lead to better police decision making. But then you will have people in the policy making chain who will say, okay, where's the evidence for that? So you end up with these I would say it's a common good. I think having more people from more backgrounds within any public service, I think, is something that we can say almost with common sense, like that must be a good thing. But without that like kind of hard evidence, policymakers can divert away from it. And we end up in the tricky situations where we're seeing a lot of initiatives like this being absolutely raised in America and then spreading out into other areas.
It's one of those things where that must obviously make sense. And yet when you look at data, it doesn't necessarily make sense. And I think inherently you could say, well, we do want to have a diverse police force from a particular perspective, but you have to always be careful with diversity, right? So you can liken it to a a flower bed or a garden, right? Oh, you like to have diversity in your garden. Does that include the weeds? Right? Probably not, right? So so you've got to make sure you don't have the weeds in there, right?
I
So yeah.
totally agree. And this is something that's I've tried to write about. It's very hard because it's such a sensitive topic. But if you bring in too much diversity into a profession where the tightness, they call it the brotherhood, the blue code of silence, you know, police forces are very tight for a reason. And that's because in most cases, the work that they do is dangerous and very high risk, and they need to be able to trust each other. Now, of course, the more that you bring in diversity, the harder that trust bridge becomes. And that then leads to more fractious decision making. And we know this because this has been tested. We do know that having more diversity in the upper ranks can create more conflict, especially with regards to management based decision making. Now, you could say, oh, you know, that's a good thing. We should bring conflict into the decision making. Well, do you know what? Sometimes in the police, that's the last thing that you need. Sometimes they have to make decisions very quickly, and being under pressure is anathema to making good decisions. And having some level of homophily might be a good thing. So we've got to be really careful about, and I use the phrase twiddle the knobs. You know, like how far do we dial this up? How far do we dial this down? It's not a simple answer. I don't think that if you go for full diversity, where you bring in people of, let's say, criminal backgrounds, that's going to help. You know, I also think that if you bring people who have never been at work in the police, I think they may struggle with well-being issues. And some of the research that I'm looking at now is that when you get into very stressful, trauma-laden situations, having someone you know in your family who's been a cop is a massive help. So if we bring people that don't have that family support in, you may end up with less resilient officers. And if you end up with less resilient officers, we're just baking in problems down the line. So as with all scientific problems, there's no easy answer. And we've got to be careful about how we twiddle the knobs.
That's the gist of it, isn't it? You've hit on two key points there. One is the unity, and there are certain systems that function, like you said, better when they don't have that diversity of decision making,
Yeah.
or possibly under certain circumstances, right? Like you need to have that
Yes.
hierarchy. Like you don't
Yes.
want a committee when you're at war or something,
That's
right?
it.
And you might make the wrong decisions, but you need to be able to make a decision. And if you have too much of a committee, you just won't make a decision.
That's right.
And
Yeah.
then the
Absolutely
dials
right.
are the other thing that humanity has such a problem with, isn't it? I mean, we just can't do grayscales. We just want one side or the other side. We want zeros or ones, and we just can't do the middle. And this is a middle, right? This is one of those things where some situations would be good with a committee, and some situations demand decision making on a pathway
Yes.
with a fixed goal.
Yeah.
And we just can't do it. I don't know what it is, what our problem is.
Well, I talk about this as simple and complex decision making in class. If I'm at a domestic violence incident, I need to be able to make a decision quickly, normally because there's one person that's at risk in there. And I have to be able to just snap my fingers, make a decision. And if I'm a sergeant or an inspector, I've got people under me, I need them to snap into line behind that decision immediately. I don't want a debate. There's harm and there's risk there and it needs sorting there. However, if I'm talking about something that's long term, maybe I'm talking about strategy, maybe we're talking about policy change, look, get diversity in the room and we'll hash this out. We can spend weeks on this decision and it isn't a problem. So trying to find a balance of where we have diversity and how we use it and where rank intercedes with it. It's all a big mess, but it's very, very worth exploring and thinking about properly. And I think there's quite a bit of areas in the cops where this is an issue that they've just not been touched ever. And we end up with the platitudes that we started with, which is diversity is a good thing. And then you've got me in the background going, well, is it actually? Like, I'm not saying that diversity is bad, but in this situation, do we want it?
You end up with a case as well where once the bureaucracy and the system, the establishment, as it were, decides on something like diversity as a strength, for a while, and we've seen this for about 10 years, and it's changing now, it's loosening up now, but we've seen it where you can't question it. You're
Yes.
a bad person if you question
Yeah.
it, even though it's obvious it should be questioned, right?
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
we should work towards that grayscale. We think neither extreme is working
That's
properly.
right. And that's a debate that's current at the moment in the UK. I'm sure you will have seen it, but we're basically talking about the immigration debate, but in a microcosm. You know,
Right.
like, so obviously I'm studying it in the police, but it's the same thing. It's the same issue. You know, if you bring in too much diversity, the community, which was quite complete and brought together is currently starting to fragment. And what do we get when we have fragmented communities? Well, to be honest, we probably end up with riots if we go all the way down the
Conflict, right?
scale.
Yeah.
Exactly. So very, very tough, very, very charged subject, which is very like me to like kind of go in with both feet forward and look at this. This looks very interesting. It's led to some great debates. I've really enjoyed it. I've been involved in some policy decisions in the UK that were right at the top of the service, and that's because of my research. And I've just had a paper published on whistleblowing because I was a whistleblower in service as well, and that was an awful experience. I can't even tell you how bad it was. I've spent the last year and a half researching that and doing interviews. You know how long these papers take to come out. So even that's been, it's the same sort of thing you're looking at. You're looking at somebody basically making a decision that is outside the common group think, and then the people in the common group think attacking them as an outsider and pushing them out. It's the same subject. It's just from inside out rather than outside in.
Yeah, I've had minor examples of that myself. And it's, yeah, when you're not in the group think, it's easy to get pushed out. It did feel like there was a short period, maybe in the 90s, early noughties, where whistleblowing was okay and there was supported. And then it's gone back. And now we're just getting like whistleblowers, let's say, disappearing, shall we say, and things like that, you know, from some of the big, I won't mention, but some of the big companies.
Yes. Yeah.
So, I mean, I could probably spend the entire interview discussing your bio. I wanted to ask one more thing, though, which was the how power structures shape people and how people can fight back. Because clearly this is highly relevant today. I mean, not just in the police force, but in the entire, well, in the entire UK where we're both sort of related to at the moment. And it feels like our power structures are, well, I believe that our power structures around the West especially have just, they've stopped listening to the people. I don't think they want to listen to the people at all, but they're clearly doing things that dramatically shape our lives. Now, we mentioned that this could very easily lead to conflict, and it does seem to be going that way. But let's say non-conflict, non-violent conflict ways of resolving this issue. Do you have any suggestions on that front?
Well, it all depends on where we start to like kind of hang causality, really. I do think, and I've just been writing about this in the follow-up books, I do think that social media has had a horrifically toxic impact on Western democracy. And it's quite weird, really, because obviously I'm in the Middle East at the moment and I'm looking at and living in a place where there's a lot of controls on social media. And I've got to be honest, it is a happier place. Now, it could be that there's other variables involved in that, but the level of toxicity that you see on Western social media is just absent. It's just not here. And people will say, oh, well, that's a lack of freedom of speech. I understand that. But I think the period that we're going through now is akin to the printing press all over again. I think that we're looking at an explosion of a communication medium that will change the world as we know it. I think we're right in the middle of that explosion now, and we're watching a kind of slow, exonerable move into polar regions. So we're looking at a fragment of the middle and a push towards the edges. And of course, when you push towards the edges, the inevitable result is much more conflict.
Right.
So what we've just been discussing is like a microcosm of the bigger things. But if we have algorithms that are trained on our worst emotions, and they are, because they're the ones that hold our attention the longest, what we essentially create are these dipping pots of either all one side or all the other. And that then, of course, then entrenches worldviews. And then with entrenched worldviews, we lose the power to negotiate and the power to find middle ground. And I think that you're seeing that most salient in America, but I definitely think that other areas are fast catching up. And I would definitely count certain areas of Europe in that as well as Canada, because I've been to Canada a few times. I love the country and I love the people in there as well. But I can just see that inevitably the same thing is happening slowly over time. So if you're talking about how we would stop this, I think unfortunately, and people won't like me saying this, but this is just the way that I feel about it. I think that you have to stop the strength of that polarization in what is our most common communication medium now. And that means putting in some sort of regulation and control into the way that we use and access social media. I do think it's one of the biggest unpickers of the glue of Western democracy. I don't think it's helping. And I know it sounds controversial and people will shout free speech until they're blue in the face. And I understand that. I really do. But I don't think that what we have now is productive. And when you look back, the same thing happened with the printing press, explosion of information, used for political means, created awful political unrest due to the way that information was disseminated. And I think that we are seeing that now, but with the internet as the medium and social media as the most prolific form of that communication spreading. So that's what I think. I'm not saying I'm right, but that's my gut feeling about it.
Right. So yeah, it's basically like the printing press dialed up to 1,000 or something.
Exactly. On
Yeah.
speed.
It's like who would have thought giving everyone a megaphone would be a bad thing?
Yes.
Currently in the UK, we do have people being arrested for what they say, probably to the highest levels anywhere in the world. Let's assume that that's probably not what you're meaning by control over
It's
the social
not.
media. So
No, it's
what?
not.
How would you suggest we sort of go ahead with this kind of?
So if I was looking at it intelligently, and I'm not saying that I can do that, but if I was trying to, I'd say that all we're doing there is policing the outcomes. We are not policing the root causes. I think the root cause is a chemical. I think that, and I'm looking at things like dopamine, serotonin. I think that the algorithms are planned and plumbed directly into them. And then the volume at which they can almost machine gun into the way that we see the world, especially if you go onto X, if I go onto the For Me feed, I'll just get endless pictures of like violence and racially segregated violence and stuff. And I'm like sat there thinking, where does this come from? Like, this is not me. There's no way that algorithm is being force fed on my choices, because when I look at all I get is nice authors posting their book covers. So I go onto the For You feed and I'm like, this is a lovely area of nice, plentiful niceness that I can bathe in. And then I switch to the other side and I'm like, oh my goodness, what's going on here? Like, this guy's just shot someone, But you can understand, especially for our youth, like having that constant, that trap in that cycle of what is essentially dopamine or serotonin or yeah, I mean, even like violence hormones. You're watching them all the time. This cannot be healthy. It's not good for us. And I've read the books with, the Jonathan Haidt stuff. I've read the Righteous Mind, things like that. But I think that that's probably at the root of it. I think we've plumbed into things that take us directly into particular pots in our brain, and they are making a lot of money from those. And I think that if we're going to be starting to regulate, I think that's where we start. I don't think we start at the outputs, which is arresting people for stupid tweets. I think that the situations that are leading to those stupid tweets, I think they need sorting out. And that's my Northern English twang coming through there as well, Edwin.
Yeah, it feels to me like again, printing press analogy, you look at the news feeds, newspapers, and then the TV media. If it bleeds, it leads is the right
That's
phrase, I
it.
guess.
Yeah.
And that seems to be what triggers us on social media as well. And it's the same kind of thing. And then you get, like, I don't go on social media very often. I don't like it. But when I do go on, it's a weird thing when you find, and people now, even people I know, like in my author circles, like posting political stuff. I'm like, just post author stuff, right?
Yes.
But it's one is outrage. And two, I find with myself, my own personality, it's like I want to post a rebuttal to try and show them the other perspective. But yet, like I'm sure you've aware of some of the research that you can't change people's minds in this way.
No.
And so it's a lost cause of even attempting to, because they just don't listen. You'll
Yeah.
listen to your own echo chamber, but you can't.
That's right.
It's feeding into these emotions that are impotent basically, but yet you still, it's just driving the society worse.
Well, have you heard of I think you will have, but the Morlock analogy of this like kind of monster that eats itself, essentially. So the analogy is that essentially it's like a zero-sum game. It's like nuclear war is like a Morlockian game, like they get more weapons, so we get more weapons, so they get more weapons, so we get more weapons, and you
Right.
end up in this horrible downward spiral that eventually just leads to everyone's destruction. And I can't help but think that the way that social media is currently regulated and monetized, it's just one giant Morlockian game, like, and we're watching it play out. And the decisions and the riots and the protests, you're looking at the result of Morlock running amok via this new communications medium. So I'm way out of my comfort zone here because I'm talking about things that I can see but I've never studied. But that's how I feel about it. And I think if we get the regulation right on these companies and we stop them basically monetizing serotonin, dopamine, etc., the way that they're doing it now, I think it leads to addiction. Well, we know that anyway because the studies are starting to come out.
Right.
But it's not just leading to addiction, it's leading to polarization, the likes of which we've never seen. So I dread to think long term what might come out of this unless they get to grips with it. And I hope that they do, but I'm not saying they will. I hope that they do.
Yeah, I know from people of our generation, we definitely have seen the polarization grow. I mean, you used to be able to talk to people on the other perspective, and now you literally don't even understand what they're saying sometimes,
Yeah,
or people have different
well,
definitions
that's right.
from different
I don't.
perspectives.
I've definitely seen the meme. I mean, there's no doubt that like 10 years ago, I would have definitely been counted as centre left, mid left, if you like, on the political spectrum.
Right.
And I know that I am now what
Almost
you would
far
probably
right,
call
probably they'll call you. Yeah, I know.
unbelievable. I mean,
I know.
I don't think that I've moved too much, but the whole like kind of as they would call it, the Overton window, like what is acceptable to discuss it in these political areas. I've definitely stepped into the right world, and that feels alien. I mean, like I've never
Yeah.
been there in my life. So
No,
something's going on.
so many people like myself, I voted left sort of all my life until sort of about 10 years ago, right? Things started so I mean, because I was sort of on the internet more regularly, but from not a non-toxic way, let's say, I became aware of the shift earlier than a lot of people, but still it's strange. And like you say, a lot of classical liberal people are now finding themselves labeled as right, and anything on the
Yes,
right these days is far right. And so you
exactly.
become, you know,
Yeah.
it's terrible, right?
I mean, it's so random. I
It's yeah.
definitely can't pass it. I can't get my head around it, but it's definitely happened. So a big shift.
Yeah, it's crazy. Well, let's get on to some of your writing. So your bio suggests that policing wasn't exciting enough for you. So you started writing. How long ago did you start, and sort of what inspired you to put pen to paper and write fiction?
So I've definitely written. I started writing when I was a teenager. I was even into writing poetry and short stories. I was entering things. I was getting stuff published. I went to a rough school in my area from the north of England where it's deprived compared to south of England. And I ended up getting quite badly bullied for it. And this was like when I was maybe like 15, 16. And I gravitated away probably in a more like kind of survival like approach really. And then I went to uni. I got fully involved in the uni life. I really enjoyed it. And I did a little bit of creative work because I was in a band and, did other things that were like my outlet. And then policing, I mean, my goodness, that's a job and a half. So, and when you're in there, it takes over your life. I had a wife and two children as well to take care of. No shame in it. For like 15 years, I didn't lift a pen. I did a lot of martial arts to keep myself in the game and fit enough to do my job. But I didn't do anything that was what I would call fun. Now, when I came here, my family didn't come out with me initially, and I was on my own. I switched out from being an on-call hostage and crisis negotiator, and I was running a police station from the uniform side. So I had about 350 officers, and I was working 60-hour weeks easy. And I stepped sideways into academia. I started teaching, and I went from working these 60-hour weeks to teaching for about 12 hours a week, plus writing research. And the change of pace was so severe that I had a couple of months where I was like almost shell shocked by it. It was a huge change, even to the point where sleeping every night was just weird. And it took maybe 6 months, maybe I think, before like the crew.
You didn't know what to do with
No,
all your extra time, basically.
I didn't. I didn't. It was so weird. And then it was about 6 months in to the career change. And I was in my own in my apartment, and I thought, God, you know what? I just read some really good books, and my brain was going. I said, look, I need to. Just got my laptop out, and that was it. That was the start. So I've probably been writing properly, as strictly as I can, for about maybe 3.5, 4 years now, and I've really enjoyed it. It's a really good outlet for me to decompress and take myself out of the humdrum of work. And if my family aren't here and I'm missing them, it's nice to go to a nice coffee shop and get yourself a good coffee and open the laptop and just escape for a few hours. So I suppose it's a bit of a solve, really, for me. But I've really enjoyed it, and it's been a lovely thing for me to do. So I definitely can't complain.
So, at what point did you decide you wanted to publish?
Well, it's weird, it's strange how these things happen, isn't it? Well, I think I was about 70,000 in, 80,000 into CRISPR, and I shared it with some friends, which was so scary. I mean, that was more scary than kicking doors in and arresting people. And I sent the script out, and I got some feedback like from the guys, and they were just like, "Yeah, you should get this out." Like, like I'd read this. And obviously that was a big shock. And you sit there and you think, well, how do I do this? And then I went through this horrific process where I finished that book. I didn't actually finish it. Let me tell you a story. It's funny. So I was about 120,000 in at this point, 125,000 in. And I went on Fiverr and I was trying to get some professional feedback. And I hired an editor, and he was a developmental editor and he was a professor of literature on that. And I thought, oh, well, he must know his stuff. I'm just going to send my So I sent it through to him, and it was what I would call like Act 1 and 2. So I'd got about Act 1 and 2 in, and I sent it off. Anyway, he had it for a few weeks, as you might expect, and it came back with these rafts of feedback, which is great. And he said at the end of it, he's like, look, you don't need an Act 3. The ending of this is great. Get this out there. It's already long enough. If you want to make this into a series, you should definitely publish. And then I thought, wow, what do I do with this? And of course, you go on a journey then, don't you? So I tried querying. The querying was just like a horrific nightmare. I've never experienced something so humiliating. When I say humiliating, I don't mean that I got
rejection.
I wasn't even getting rejections, Edwin. I was just not getting any replies. And then the ones that I did send like larger sections to, they'd come back and they'd just say, look, there's no market for this. And I was like, well, how do you make a market? Like, if we're going to get sci-fi back on its feet, surely we should be starting to publish sci-fi, but they only, and I obviously you find this out, but they only publish to market. So you end up in this really weird position. And then I started to watch some bloggers online about self-publishing, and I thought, look, I'm just going to do it. Both feet in, let's try. And I did. The self-publishing process was lovely. I really enjoyed it, only because I had control of it and I didn't have to listen to any of the feedback. So that was really good. I got some good reviews on there initially and made some sales and everything. But I know that to be successful, you need to start to have a body of work. So once I'd got that first one out, I was like, look, I'm just going to have to get feet in and go for like the second and third and just start. And it was weird, but the second one came out way quicker. I mean, it was just like totally different to the first book. And of course, you look back at your first book and you're reading it and cringing and thinking, oh, goodness, did I really put that in there? But I can't do anything with that now. And I'm firmly of the belief that once it's out there, it's out there. Don't take it back. Don't start pontificating about it. Just move on, get better. Maybe you'll revisit properly, in 5 years' time or whatever. But for now, if you're happy with it, leave it. So that's what I've done.
How have you found the marketing process then?
Oh, I think I wasted a lot of money. I mean, God, I'm in so much debt just from self-publishing. No, as in, I'm not in debt because obviously I've used my own money. What I mean is that in terms of the amount of money I've spent on publishing the book and what I've earned back from selling it, I mean, they're not even on the same page, And I made some really, what I would call like some quite uninformed decisions where I was hiring people from Upwork and Fiverr that just turned out to be absolutely useless. And it was only through trial and error that I got to the point where I found people that I trusted that I could work with. And I did get them eventually. They've been really good. I've also found I've got a close group of friends and they're excited when I send them chapters, and that's a great feeling. So
yeah, no, that's good.
I use them quite a bit, probably a little bit more than I should. So I'm now in a position, I think, where I could have a little pipeline from like writing through to self-publishing and be happy enough to know that the end result is good enough. It might not be a polished Penguin novel and it might not be to market, but in terms of the quality of the writing and the pace of the story and everything, I like to think that I've done okay. And again, I'm quite happy with that. I know that my first book's not going to be a masterpiece.
So do you have, just before we move on to your book, do you have any advice for something that has worked really well? Or let's say of the things you've done for marketing, what's the one that's been the best, do you think?
Yeah, that's a hard one. I tried TikTok. TikTok was just like the worst thing I've ever done. Hated it as a platform. I hated Book Talk. I tried to research Book Talk. Not for me at all. I did a load of direct emails. The direct emails definitely got me more traction. If I was to give a tip, I would just say, look, be personal. Like, speak with people, not cut and paste, not chat GPT. Speak with them, email them, be nice, be sincere, offer a copy of the book for free. Let them read it, let them review it, let them be honest about it. Don't get your knickers in a twist if they don't like it. Get it out there, be authentic, be nice, don't push, don't be entitled.
Being professional, isn't it? Like approach professionally in terms of your expectations and something like that.
Absolutely. Now, I feel like it's a massive privilege to be on your podcast, Edwin.
Thank you very much.
That's how I genuinely feel. I don't see this as an extra marketing experience that I can grab. It's kind of like I'm going to speak to somebody who's interested in my work and interested in me, and they're giving me their time, and I know how hard editing is. So just be honest and just be nice and just be authentic and just appreciate the time that others will give you. And when you're speaking with people, be direct. Don't mess about. Don't
Yeah.
hide stuff. Don't try and like finagle. You know, just try and be yourself. I
Yeah.
suppose that's the best example that I've got.
Be honest, professional, and try not to waste people's time, basically,
That's
right?
it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even the rejections were polite. You know, people just saying, look, I'd love to read your book, but I've got a massive to-do list. I can't fit it in. Brilliant. Thank you so much for even replying to me. That's the sort of healthy approach that I've had to take. But I just see the whole thing as I mean, it's not just you, like other people that have given me the time to even read my work. That feels like a privilege as well. So I'm not at the point where I mean, maybe it's because I'm not relying on the income and this is something that I want to do. Maybe that's a big driver. But I just find that, again, just being honest, professional, nice, direct emails, don't use AI, you know, like very, very generic tips. They're my
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
generic tips.
Yeah. Be authentic. Yeah.
That's it.
So we'll move on to your book now. We've spent a lot of time talking about some really interesting things, but not really your book yet. So, um,
Okay. Don't worry.
I mean, yeah, again, so many of my guests, and you're one of them that I would love to spend hours just on your background and exploring the things you're working on. But your debut novel is CRISPR, Deus Ex Homine. This, according to your own blurb, it blends genetic supremacy, cybernetic warfare, and the philosophical descent into posthumanism. And it asks a simple question: what happens when a perfect physical human specimen is forced to evolve? And so we'll definitely get into the key parts there of post or transhumanism, the genetics, the cyborg and stuff. But one thing that stood out very early on was all of the stuff about Nietzsche. You have a lot of quotes from Nietzsche in there. Is that someone you've studied philosophically, or did you just find that it really fit well with this story?
It definitely started with me when I think I just mentioned that period when I came out and I just left the police and I felt at a loose end and I had no idea what to do with my life. And obviously I was working, so you've got some direction and I'm supporting my children, but all of a sudden I have much more free time. And I was listening to podcasts, just loads of them in my downtime. And some of them happened to discuss Nietzsche. And I was like, this sounds interesting. And I signed up to a very well known podcast called the Nietzsche Podcast with a guy called Keegan. And I really enjoyed it. Even when I'm back at home, I'll go walk the dog for 2.5 hours and put Keegan on and listen to him. I've tried to read the source material. I have read some of it. It's quite hard to pass. And having it secondhand through someone like Keegan talking to you about it, it just got my brain wondering and thinking. And there's a really good episode where he talks about, did the Nazis take on Nietzsche? You know, like, so did they take that on as a philosophy? And the answer was no. Like, you know, they took on parts, but there's other parts they really didn't.
They
And
kind
then,
of
of course,
picked and chose from a
they
various
did.
philosophies,
That's
didn't
exactly
they?
what, yeah. So, and then, of course, that left me with that weird thinking when I sat there and thinking, well, what if someone did? Like, if there was a religion that was based on what Nietzsche's teachings were, what would it look like today? And that's what led to the creation of the edits, and which is obviously my genetic supremacist race in the books. So very, very interesting little fish hook there that caught me in. I'm not a Nietzschean, so I don't subscribe to everything, but some of his stuff, I mean, it's incredible. Like you would with any of the great philosophers, there's some bits where you just think, my goodness, he was on the nose with that. And I've tried to use him as much as I can because obviously Kris is a devotee initially of Nietzsche, and the antagonist is full Nietzsche.
Right.
So Kanan is full Nietzsche. So we've got this interesting interplay between them, which develops. It was nice because it gave me a nice little structure, and it gave me some of the, like, you know, when I'm trying to figure out motivations for my characters, I can rely on his writing, which is really cool.
Right.
So yeah, it gave me a little bit of direction. It was interesting. I've read some Schopenhauer, and I've even gone back. I've done some listening to Socrates and Aristotle and Plato and stuff like that. But this one, I mean, Nietzsche just totally took my imagination and off it went, which is why you've got the book.
Right, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought up the Nazis there because I was curious on the world building to some degree because obviously you mentioned the genetic edits, one of the key parts, and I looked up the sort of because I think the religion, the Nietzschean religion in the book has eight premises that it's based on. One of them being the Übermensch, which does seem very Nazi-like, and then you have the genetic supremacy, etc. I was wondering for a brief period whether this was a world where the Nazis had won or something, but yeah, like as you mentioned, it's there's aspects that are similar.
There is. One of the twists, and I mean, it'll come in the later books, is that the temple which runs on Nietzsche isn't actually running on Nietzsche. Even they have changed some of his writings in order to hold better control over the people that they manage and run. So essentially, the temple, which is like the religion of nature, is not full nature. And I had to do that because I don't think you could run a full religion on nature. And also, like I've mentioned on the back there, if you were looking at how you would develop control from a religious perspective, there's certain things that you would have to just alter and switch from nature, because nature is all about you becoming the best version of yourself in terms of an individual, individual, most creative. I mean, if the final stage is the child, and the child is someone that creates in the world, if you can't have a religion where everyone's creating stuff, because you've got no control. I mean, it's chaos. So there needs to be some level of control, and that's why there was a little bit of massaging with the 8 in order for it to fit. But that's what people do in real life. So like that's how religions are created, and these systems of control come from this like kind of bending and twisting of the original teaching, until you end up in a place where you've got enough control to then start to enforce some level of like propagation over time. So like same thing with Christianity. You could talk about the same thing. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's really interesting because a lot of these religions, and like just looking briefly through the list of Nietzsche, of sort of the 8 points on Nietzsche there, suggests that while it could form a religion, it couldn't necessarily form a structured religion. And the same thing, like you say, with Christianity, obviously that was significantly warped from the beginning, as most religions are. And there's other ones that we can watch in real time, sort of shifting and changing with in bounds of their structure and things like that. And you have a character, well, you mentioned Cain. Is it Cain or Canaan? Canaan. And he at one point does make a comment about the temple, doesn't he? I believe
he does.
Where he's, because like you say, he's full Nietzsche, but he doesn't support the temple, and that's that's obvious, and you see the conflict within the belief structures there. So
that's really interesting. And that comes to the 4, book 2 and 3 is like it's an exploration of that a little bit. So it's been so interesting to explore this stuff, because you're trying to make a world that's believable, but at the same time you're trying to introduce fantastical elements like any sci-fi. So you've got to tread that fine ladder of how do I get this in? My main character's like genetically edited to the gills. How do I make this realistic? You've got to find a way, haven't you, one way or another? So, yeah, that was a strange one. Just as a little bit of backstory, but I'm a TEDx organizer, and I went to get my license, and it was in Banff, and it was gorgeous. What an amazing place. And I spent 2 weeks there learning how to get my license. And in that 2 weeks, they gave some sample talks, and one of the sample talks was on CRISPR, the genetic editing. And I managed to speak to the lady that gave the talk afterwards, and I picked her brain, and I was like, God, could we do this with humans? And she's like, oh yeah, absolutely, it's coming, like that sort of conversation. And then obviously I went and read everything I could about it, because that's the kind of brain I've got. And that's where I ended up with my title, which is a play on CRISPR.
It's one of the technologies that the bureaucracy is not ready to deal with, which is pretty much
totally agree.
Every technology nowadays, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
We'll get into a few more, but yeah. It's crazy because it's been around. Well, actually, I left research in like 2006. It was around slightly before that, but it didn't really come on the scene until a few years after that, and then everyone started talking about it. And it hasn't reached its potential, I think, partially or maybe largely because of ethics as well, right? So
that's exactly right.
Yeah,
and I try and tackle that in a subtle way, but it's one of the biggest problems, because the premise for the main book is that Russia and China, because of their lack of ethical restraint when it comes to this sort of research, basically carved ahead with CRISPR and ended up producing genetically edited humans that were creating immense problems for the West when it came to war. And eventually the West had to catch up. And Kris, who is the main character, is one of those catch-ups. So he's one of the first, second, I think it's third pool of genetic edits now who have been born in the UK. And he's part of the West trying to catch up to Russia and China, who have forged ahead with CRISPR and humans.
Right. And your book is set, it's at least 100 years. How far into the future would it be?
It is 100 years. It's 100 years. 2024. Okay. Yeah.
Right. So I was curious, and maybe this is my own interpretation of modern geopolitics, but you did go with a world that had the same more or less powers in it. UK, you mentioned US, I think. I don't know the state of them in the story, but then you mentioned China and Russia, obviously. Is that something, I'm just curious why you went with that? Would you just feel like these national structures are going to continue on?
Well, that's a really good question. I think I would agree with you. I think that if you go 50 years ahead, the power balance will have totally shifted. Africa will be one of the major power bases, I would have thought, especially with regards to the demographics. But I needed something that would anchor the reader enough for it to sort of make sense. Because I think if you're going to go with some really high concept stuff, sometimes the readers totally struggle. And I mean, I tried to read Werner Vinger. It's too out there. I can't anchor myself in the world. So I made some conscious decisions, and I think you're right. I think I needed something that would allow the readers to just hook in and just say, "Oh, I can see how this could happen," which is the
Yeah,
sort
yeah.
of the push towards it.
Yeah, that is something science fiction authors have to be aware of, isn't it? You can try and go with these concepts, but you have to figure out how you can make it relatable to the reader so that they can
Yes,
understand where you're coming from, isn't it?
yeah, and some of them I have really enjoyed. Some like really weird series, but I do find it harder. Like I'm a third of the book in before I'm hooked. Whereas
Hmm.
there's others where I'm like, one chapter in, I'm like, oh, I'm good now. You can just leave me for a few hours. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
So there's some that you have to like kind of struggle your way into. If I'm really honest with you, Edwin, it wasn't too much of a conscious choice. It was kind of like, well, if I was looking for the goodies and the baddies, if you like, within the current power structures, how would they look? And if I took the idea of CRISPR and I pushed it 100 years in the future, what would we have with the current world?
Right.
So that's the kind of playpen that you've got in the book.
All right. And you said it in Neo Manchester, which is based on a place you're familiar with, then obviously
Yeah.
conscious choice. That just make it easier on the world building. Did you incorporate places you knew in Manchester and just sort of cyberpunk them
Yes.
or yeah.
Yes. And there's more to come in the next book with that, definitely.
Did you have a lot of fun with that? Did you sort of take a mental walk down Manchester going, okay, what if this was like this? What if that was like,
Kind of, yeah. I mean, I know the place quite well because I live about 40 minutes away and we visit all the time. So the city centre and all that is a regular haunt. I tell you what, I had more fun playing with the kind of like police procedural stuff. Like, what would a cop look like? How would they create case files? How would a professional standards investigation be run? Like all that sort of thing. I really enjoyed that. But that could be because I suppose I've got a lot more experience in that area that came out.
yeah, I had a feeling that that was a part you liked about it. You had your investigator who did go
Maury,
through
yeah.
a fair amount of
Yeah.
detail
Yeah.
in his
So,
journey.
I mean, it was an interesting one, really. Like when you're at a crime scene and you're trying to take the details in. I was a trainee detective for 2 years, and I worked on burglary robbery team, and I was on force major incident team, so I did a murder investigation. And some of the stuff that, I mean, if what you've got a full team of like 10 to 12 people doing now with the right technology, you can probably do it with one. And that
Right.
was like the kind of idea from the Maury perspective. And I think that's probably the way it's going as well. And I think about, I mean, just to give you a classic example, like if I turn up at an assault, like a basic assault, I might have 4 or 5 witnesses, and I'd have to speak to all of them. I'd have to take statements from them. And when I've got the statements, I have to go back to the station, and then I've got 3 or 4 hours writing a file. And then when I've done the file goes through to the Crown Prosecution Service, and they make transcripts. And then I've got to say that that's what they said on an interview, and maybe I've got another 2 interviews to do. The point that I'm making is it just goes on and on and on. Even a basic assault file can be like 50, 60 hours work. With the right technology, I mean, we can cut this down to two.
Yeah, I was just
You know,
thinking that everything you were describing is just like, okay, you put that into AI and it's all basically done as soon as
yeah,
you input the source material, isn't it?
that's it.
Yeah,
And with digital helpers, you're on the next level after that. So even
yeah,
if you need task doing, you just task your helper, and your helper goes
yeah.
and does
The
it for you.
AI agents and things like,
That's it.
the next level.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Um, yeah. So that's really interesting because this is ultimately, I would say, you say post-humanist, I call it transhumanist. Maybe there's a subtle difference between the two terms. So we do have gene edits. So the main character, Kris, is a gene edit as well as the main antagonist. Then there's what we would call cyborgs, which seems to be a fairly large percentage of the population has some kind of modification, and especially on the police force. Now, I was wondering, so you have AIs as well, of course, and I'd like to get into that a little bit, but the AIs are they built within a module in their head? Is that how you envisioned it?
yes, yeah. And some of them, I do talk about it in one of the chapters, but it's fleeting. Essentially, it's like Neuralink. So we're
Right.
seeing the basics of it now, where people can control a mouse pointer, for instance, with their thoughts. That's intrusive because they drill into the skull to attach sensors. But what we don't have is an ability at the moment for those things to function with the human body as a battery. Now, there's a presumption in there that the technology has developed enough for that to happen. So the technology runs off the human battery, if you like, and it's implanted. And that means that you have internal AI agents that essentially are with you at all times, and you can have conversations with them, tell them to go away, bring them back, use them, not use them, etc. And this is all me extrapolating and pushing Neuralink right to its fringes. Like, what could we get in 100 years, which was the premise, if you like, for
Yeah, I
CRISPR.
thought that was interesting because, I mean, obviously implanted technology is not a particularly new idea. I had it in some of my books, and then when Neuralink started up, I was like, oh, thank you, Elon, because now I can have a real world basis. But what I did
Yes,
really like was, as you just said, using the body as a battery. So basically, the devices burn calories as well.
yes,
In which
yeah,
case, you'd think maybe you don't have to have any overweight people anymore. I don't know. It depends on the
that's
implant,
true.
but
Yeah.
so that's quite interesting. I wonder how long that would take to develop. But do you have the AIs were really interesting to me because right now we're sort of we're beyond the beginning stage, but we're still nearish the beginning. I mean, a lot of people haven't adopted it. A lot of people in the writing world are really against it. It's going to be something that stays. You know, the business world will definitely take it on. And you have a lot of personal AI. So basically, every character in the story has trained their AI themselves, it seems, to be, to do what they want and to have the personality they want. They've given it their name. Now, we can't easily do that yet, but it is possible. I'm just curious because we focus on a small number of characters in the book, but there's some interesting things that come out of that. We've already had, people falling in love with their AIs, for example.
Yep.
So what do you think a world would be like where everyone can train their personal AI to be, because it does feel a little bit sometimes like Tony Stark, for example, with some of the characters.
No, I sort of get it. This has been tricky for me really because I had there's a in the 19 not the 19s the 2090s there's an event called Tech Plague, and this is a post Tech Plague, and he talks about it in one of the chapters, but essentially we turn Neuralink into a dopamine trigger, a direct dopamine trigger. And this all came, funnily enough, from the conversation that we were having earlier about social media. So there's some well-known experiments where when rats are provided with cocaine-laced water, they will press that button until they die, unless their environment is enriching enough to keep them from becoming essentially horrific cocaine addicts. And if we take Neuralink to its what it could do, is there a potential for us to be able to basically attach it to what we would call like the pleasure center areas of the brain and then press a button and say, okay, I want some pleasure, please, tick. If it's unregulated and it progresses at the speed that it's progressing now, there is a potential for what happened to the rats to happen to humans. And we're looking at the precursor with social media. If social media is doing what it's doing now, if you put Neuralink in there and you add this dopamine trigger, there's a potential for people to just become zombies that are attached to their Neuralinks.
You mentioned with the pleasure centers, that brings to mind the challenge we're having now of procreation as well. Clearly, fertility rates. Now, we haven't delved into scientifically a lot of what the causes are, but some of those causes appear to be social. And with what you're saying happens, you can more or less kiss goodbye to natural procreation, couldn't you?
You could. A lot of it will be synthetic, and there is Selena Voss, who's one of the later characters in the book, has pleasure implants and uses them. Like, she's perfectly happy using them. She doesn't need a man, so the pleasure implants are all there. But the characters are quite restrained on the use of their AI. They've got them, they're integrated, but they're quite restrained. So they're not 100% in it, if you like. The AI is like a side character. And this is like it's an outcome of the tech plague, where the tech plague happened. Everyone realized how dangerous technology and AI was. And now people have these like allocated AIs that are almost like side characters in their lives, as opposed to having this like all becoming being inside their brains, which will have been limited and regulated out after the tech plague, which became a major disaster. But there's not too much in about the tech plague. I've just written another book, which is pre-tech plague, for the for this time, and basically it's taken us in the run up to the Tech Plague. Same world, but it's like that's book 3. It's in edit at the moment, so it's with people tearing it to shreds. I dread to think what's going to happen when it comes back. But yes, that's the bigger world.
Because that's interesting, yeah. Because I had noted that all the AIs were sort of current level AIs, maybe slightly advanced, and I had wondered what would happen if one of the AIs became self-aware. Because you mentioned Selena, and of all the characters, my bet would be that her AI was controlling her almost. So I had wondered, but since you mentioned that they kind of intentionally regulate, now I'm sure at some level someone has still gone past that regulation, but it does explain why it's not rampant, at least. Yeah.
Yes. So the AI becoming sensitive is that book that you just talked about. So that's the one that I've just written. So that's the bit that leads to the Tech Plague. So that was very good, actually. So thank you for that segue, Edwin.
Unintentional plug for your next books.
Yeah, very good.
So you mentioned Selena. I mean, I'm skipping over a lot of sort of subtopics here because otherwise we'll go on for like 5 hours, which I would love to do, but I'd be dead sitting here in my chair for 5 hours anyway. But
Yes.
Selena Voss, I think you said her name was properly. Yeah. I was listening on the audiobook, so I don't always process all the names fully. But Selena Voss is the head of basically a corporation that's, let's say, doing some dirty stuff in regards to this. And she's very unethical person,
Yes,
as we
she
can
is.
see. And what I'm wondering is, so this kind of speaks to obviously anyone I think who's paying attention must see this. And in some ways, it leads back to the beginning of our discussion with the book as well, with the Nazis, or at least broader version of fascism. Because in my understanding of the early fascism ideas, the economic fascism is the link between government and corporations. And that's really sort of what this brings to mind. And what I personally think we're seeing in the West is the governments and corporations really tightly in bed, governments heavily managing the corporations, even using them sometimes. And so was she sort of like, because Cyberpunk is basically corporate
It
control.
is.
So
Yeah.
is that sort of where you got her idea? And did you intentionally try to make it sort of mirror of our reality? Or is that just because our reality is mirroring Cyberpunk now?
Oh, do you know what? I mean, that what you've just said is quite scary, really, but also true. There's stuff that's going on now with your very big tech companies that scares the pants off me, if I'm being really honest. And some of that stuff is definitely incorporated in what is the version of the corp in the book. The other bit of Selena, which is the kind of the corporate language, the need for control, the excessive like measurement, the kind of like tendrils in lots of different pots, that strangely enough came from my experience working in senior management in the cops. And I don't mean that the cops are corrupt. I mean the general need for this kind of all knowing, all seeing, all measured, all controlled. That was definitely a feeling that I got in strategic meetings in the Home Office and in the police. And I took some of that and I kind of married it to like I know some people are actually calling them tech fascists now,
Mm.
but when you marry those concepts together, you get my version of the corp essentially in the book.
Right. I guess you can see, I mean, wouldn't say sympathize, but you can see the pathway that takes a person or an organization to the direction of control. I mean, I think if we try to give some credit to our government, we can see that, well, it's a Tony Stark. So since it's a science fiction,
Yeah.
it's a Tony Stark in the MCU Infinity Saga, right? Protection in his case. And he gets driven by this need for protection and it almost destroys him. And eventually it does actually end his life. Spoiler alert if you haven't seen it.
I love the Tony Stark character arc. I mean,
Yeah.
I, I read all the comics when I was younger, but it was an absolute privilege to watch all the films with my daughter. My daughter's an MCU nut, so it's been amazing to like watch them as she's grown up. She's now at college, but during that time, I absolutely loved all the way through. The whole story arc was so cool, and there's probably quite a lot of influences in there. I do think that there is an archetype there, but there's an archetype for a reason. And as Carl Jung would say, like we don't see these archetypes for nothing. Like they're there.
Yeah. No, exactly.
And granted, you might see your authors like extrapolate them and make them more salient, which is what you do with your character building. but there's still an element of human nature. There's nothing new in the way that those people behave. All that's new is the technology that enables them. And
Right.
God, that takes us all the way back from right at the very beginning when we were talking about all of the technology stuff. But yes, that
Yeah.
definitely.
It all comes in circles, doesn't it? Yeah.
It does. Yeah, it
Well,
does.
that's interesting. Yeah. Because I was thinking in England again, or in the UK, the government corporate link. I mean, we have very high electricity bills, and yet they're building in. I had ChatGPT just do a public search of, and it come up with, I think, at least a dozen data center projects, which, they're obviously putting the subsidizing of the electricity bills onto the population, basically, right? Because
Yes.
what company is going to want to come in under that condition?
Yes. You're
Um,
right.
and then something I discovered only a year or two ago, rent a crowd, crowds on demand, that kind of thing. So are you aware of
Oh, that
that?
was sort of like the kind of public demonstration stuff.
Yeah, so I mean there's companies that will create a crowd for you if you want. So astroturfing basically, right? So
Yeah,
who knows these protests we see how much of this is actually
is actually real.
yeah,
Yeah.
because there's always a criticism, oh, you're paid by whoever. And the people are like, well, no, we're not. But then you're like, okay, but you have all the same t-shirts, you have all the same signs, and you were bussed in. Like someone's paying for that, right? It's not out of the
Right.
goodness of your
You're
heart.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's amazing though, because I went to, there's two sites that do it that are common. Rent a Crowd was interesting because on their website, they make it look like it's all for PR and, you can do it for advertising and modeling and stuff. But then the image they have for their banner is all people with the fist in the air, right?
No
So
way.
so you're like they're hinting
Oh my
very
goodness.
obviously at activism. And
Yeah.
crowds on demand, they don't even hint at it. They just straight up tell you this is
Goodness
for
me.
advocacy. So it's so weird and that's very much a link between, well, in this case, corporations and manipulating
Yeah.
public opinion,
Yes.
basically.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, funnily enough, and I will tell you, one of the major storylines in the second book is something called story weaving, which is almost like probability mapping for how a narrative will expand when released into the population,
hmm.
and then a conscious design by corp and government for how they want that narrative to develop. So it's one of the major storylines in the second book, but it's exactly what you've just talked about. So I had to bring it in.
Is that actually based on stuff you've discovered in your research then? Because it does sound like the behavioral psychology departments would be doing
That's
something like
exactly
that.
what it is. So if you push like past things like nudge, a lot of the stuff that I write is like based on real science, but then pushed out into the fringes. And
Right.
so if you were looking at the use of nudge now in things like Cambridge Analytica, Brexit, but then you brought it in, you industrialized it, you professionalized it, and you twinned powerful AI with well-trained behavioral researchers, you could, the premise is that you could map and manipulate narratives at scale. That's look, I think that's happening now.
Hmm.
I'm being 100% honest, but in the CRISPR world, the technology behind it will be way more developed. The decision-making research that I've done is on the Bayesian brain, how it works, which is just probability mapping essentially. So like it's taking machine learning and then putting it on steroids and then feeding it into like, the world's biggest supercomputer. That's the sort of idea that you could get in 100 years, how good it might be, especially if you can bring in quantum computing, which is even
Yeah.
more scary.
Yeah.
So yeah, scary times.
Yeah, it's interesting because I do have the feeling that it's happening to some degree now. I just think it's being done rather badly, at least
Yes,
by
I
our
agree.
European
Yeah,
governments. Yeah.
yeah.
It's like they
Well,
want to
if
do
you
it, but it's not
really
working, right?
just a recommendation, go and watch the podcast with Dominic Cummings. Dominic Cummings was the lead advisor on the Brexit campaign,
Right.
and he talks about how they used what is essentially behavioral insights in order to influence the voting. And he thinks it was extraordinarily successful. Like you said, it's almost like blunt force trauma when it comes to behavioral mapping, but it worked stupendously. And if that worked stupendously, then you immediately have to wonder about what's possible if you put some sophisticated minds and some really good technology behind it, and how this could be totally invisible to the vast majority of the population and be
Mm.
fully orchestrated from the other end of the population, which is horrible.
Yeah. I
So,
mean, I think the part that most people who follow this kind of stuff would be aware of would be what they did in COVID, for example, with the,
yes.
as you said, the
Yeah.
nudge unit in
Yeah.
COVID as well. So yeah, I mean, it's always ongoing, isn't it? Frightening.
Oh, yes.
So I think we're getting towards the end of our time. I had one more question, what I call the big question here. This is relating to William Gibson's quote, "The future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed." And I think it will become less and less evenly distributed as it advances. So my question is basically the increasing pace of technology means the average person lags further and further behind, like what I consider the wave front, the front of social infrastructure, basically, as it's being developed. Now, to the powers, that means they become less and less valuable. And we didn't even talk sort of about Peter Thiel and transhumanism very much or anything like that. And it's up to the point where they're almost a bother to be managed, right? They literally think of us a little bit like cattle, it feels like at times. So even now, power structures are ignoring the will of people in favor of policies that come from unelected bodies like the UN or the WEF, things like that, all linked
Or the
together.
EU.
Or the EU, yeah. Putting in all-encompassing systems to control us when the media rhetoric fails. So the people who don't buy the news were basically forced into certain directions anyway. So, and even your story, I was thinking, is a battle of giants, right? Like your story is genetic edits and Uber hackers and ultra cyborgs, right, fighting it out. And we don't see like the average person. So if technology continues moving forward at this pace, let's say the world that you've presented is not necessarily far from what might happen, what future do you see for the average person in that world? Like, what will they be doing? Because jobs, maybe not so much, and they're just there to be not a problem for the rich and powerful. Like, what is the purpose of the average person?
Do you know what? That's a really good question. I portray them in a particular way in CRISPR, which is kind of like semi-mindless drones which are enthralled to their technology, and that is so you've basically got the rise of the of technology as a god in the background, and this is definitely going to come as the books progress. But the real threat, it isn't this like kind of strange battle between edits and all the rest of it. The real threat is the very slow loss of humanity into ever encroaching technological augmentation, which is like a kind of it's a trope of cyberpunk, but the way that I've tried to build it makes it slightly different with the inclusion of the tech rot. And tech rot gets explored in the second book and also in the one that's the prequel. But tech rot is basically where the body will involuntarily reject elements of technological augmentation and no one can figure out why. So essentially, they try to put in implants. Slowly, the flesh around the implant will rot. And this includes neurological. So you end up with people with quite serious brain damage because the body refuses to take on technology. And it's not even subtle, but tech rot is my way of putting in a message that the body will always reject the over technological encroachment. It's going to find a way. And the tech rot is the big signal for us to say, look, underneath all this are real humans. Like, you've got to let go of this. You have to put your phone down. You have to get off your computer once in a while, because these things are ever more becoming us and not part of us. Like, they're becoming us. You
Right.
know, I know that sounds heavy, but that's exactly what's happening. So I've tried to explore it a little bit. And the other thing as well, and we mentioned it early, but I'm hoping for I think it's going to be 5 books. I think it's going to be a 5-book series, Chris PR. And it's essentially about the rise of religion. And I know that sounds really weird. You're only getting like small parts of it in the first book, but it's about religion that's been massively subjugated and pushed to the bottom of the rungs, slowly but surely becoming more prominent, and then eventually becoming a full-blown uprising with a rebellion. So the last book is the rebellion book, and we're seeing with the starts of Chris PR. Yes, you get all the cyborgs and all that sort of thing, but in reality, I'm building what is a rebellion movement in the same way as I've read some really boring books on this, Edwin. I've read some really boring books. So there's a book by a guy called Marshall Gans, and it's called When David Beats Goliath, and it's about the union movement and how the union movement eventually managed to topple and overthrow the corporation directives for workers' rights. And it's very interesting to get some insight into how they did it and how they managed it, how they built the strategy. And I would like to say that I would like to bring in that subtlety in the way that a rebellion builds over the 5 books. You will see it very, very slowly come to the fore until we end up with a bigger uprising with its heroes. Of course, we have some heroes in there, but that's the overall big story arc.
Okay, yeah. Now I did see the religion in there, and it sort of because it did stand out from us for science fiction stories, and we don't often have a lot of religion in there. I was wondering, in fact, do you think that we'll move to more spirituality
Yes,
again coming back? Because it
yes.
does feel like certain religious movements are building again now, whether that's just a swing from left to right. But I also feel like there is a spiritual movement building
No,
as well.
I definitely think there is, and I think that that's a very natural, unconscious reaction to what technology creates in us as humans. I think that there will be a yearning for the spiritual side of things, and I'm saying that as somebody who's secular, but I'm in a religious country. I watch how much religion shapes their day and their life. They have far, and it's going to sound trite, but they have far more meaning in their lives than we do, Edwin. Like it's,
Hmm.
religion really matters to them, and it gives them structure, it gives them predictability, it gives them a way of seeing things in the future. It gives all these like kind of human things that help people plan and sustain and be resilient, and we've watched the slow erosion of them over time, and then we've seen technology kick in and begin to strip it away even more. I think the body will be unconsciously, and this is going to sound weird, but it's almost like a tech rot analogy where the body starts to push back. And I think the body pushing back might be where we're seeing that push towards spirituality, because I think people yearn for meaning in their lives. And I think that a lot of this technology strips it out.
Yeah.
So there's something there in the background that's just pushing people towards it. It's a really interesting, fertile place to play when you're writing this. It's been interesting to write about and explore the characters' thoughts on it. I've really enjoyed it. And as not as an overly religious person, it's been a bit of an education for me as well because I've had to do some research.
Yeah, that's interesting because I'm not a fan of fundamentalist religion, but one of the things that, I mean, I grew up like many of us did, going to church when I was young and stuff. One of the things that always bothered me with Western Christians was that I never felt they actually believed in their religion. Like they
Yeah,
went to church, but they didn't act as if they believed in it. I don't mean they acted as
yeah,
bad people. It's just that some of the fundamentals that they should have acted differently, in my opinion.
yes,
And that
yeah.
was something and so I don't know, maybe this is a return to, again, it always goes too far with humans. So I'm always worried that it's going to swing too far. But,
I would
something
agree.
that at least you have to, if you believe in something, you have to act as if you believe in it, or you don't really believe in my opinion. But and
Well,
that
that's
doesn't mean I
taking me
want a
back.
religious war or anything, but
No, no. Well, that's taking me back right back to like Jordan Peterson 10, 15 years ago when he was lecturing at
Mm,
Harvard. And I love that stuff. I don't like much of his modern stuff, but I love his old stuff. And where he was talking about justified true belief essentially being your action as predicated upon belief, as in, like
right.
you would say, the God becomes real because you act as if that person is real.
Yeah.
But to do that, you must have meaning. And I'm not quite sure, I'm not quite sure what these devices generate in terms of meaning for us. I think they strip them out, especially if we've got these like serotonin, dopamine triggered things going on in the background. So I think there might be an inevitable backswing. And like you say, we're seeing it on the American right at the moment. You see an uprising against woke, which is going nuts. And you are seeing old fashioned racism surfacing again, nasty
Mm,
stuff.
yeah.
So you are right to worry about the backlash, I think. But there'll definitely be a swing. And I think the swing will partially be about people trying to find meaning in their lives again. Because, yeah, if it carries on as it does, well, you end up with people as drones being run by their technology
Yeah,
as
no,
opposed.
I do agree that we're looking for the search of meaning, I think, and that's being eroded, and that sort of lack of meaning colors the way people react. Like even with the protesters we mentioned earlier, they're looking for meaning, they're looking for a purpose, and I think
Yeah.
that's a common thing with everyone, isn't it?
Yes. I think, well,
Yeah.
some people would say that that's probably one of the things that sets us apart as a species, that we look for meaning and that's intrinsically rooted with consciousness. I don't know any of the answers to those sorts of questions, but I definitely know when there's a hole in my life when it comes to
Yeah.
meaning.
It
I
seems
can
like it would
feel it.
be like a natural consequence of being aware of our own mortality, I guess.
Yes.
You would
Yeah.
want to have meaning, yeah. Yeah. So on that note, don't know if that's positive or negative. I think it's just an interesting statement. But I'm aware that we're about out of time. So it's been great chatting with you. Before you go, perhaps you could let us know of any when your upcoming books are coming out, if you're working on any more in the series, and when you think, what your timeline for that might be, where we can find you online, and if you'll be in any upcoming events.
Cool. So no events as of yet. I'm still trying to build up my back catalogue. You'll find me on X, GS Morgan, and I'm on gs-morgan.com if you want to find me on the website. In terms of books, Amy 3, which is the next CRISPR book, is in the final stages of editing while I work through my editor's furious notes on the last 10 chapters. So probably within the next few weeks, that will be good to be released. I have the prequel, which is called 404 User Not Found, currently out to query. So who knows with that one, Edwin? That may never, ever come to fruition. It could be that in 6 months' time, I choose to self-publish that. And there will also be a small novella, which is set in the tech plague, that will be coming out with Amy 3. And that's going to be a free book that anybody can download and dip their toes into the CRISPR universe.
Excellent. Yeah, it is a richly developed world. And I just realized we didn't even talk about Amy 3 and her interesting characteristics. But maybe we can have you back on another time to chat about
I'd love
more
to,
things.
Edwin. This has been amazing. Again, I'd just like to say thank you for having me. Just for you, any time like this is a privilege, and I just appreciate it. So thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure. GS Morgan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Edwin.
And thank you for listening. Information and links related to this and all episodes are available at alternatefutures.co.uk. I'm also over at Substack under Alternate Futures, where I post articles on science fiction, socio-technological issues, and futurism. You can subscribe for free or sign up for a paid account if you'd like to support the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not share it with friends, writers, and other sci-fi fans you know? And if there are any indie sci-fi creators you'd like to see featured, send me a message at podcast@alternatefutures.co.uk. Once again, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me on the next episode.
This is the future. Human error. Evolution. This is the future.